taught. If you're not, then you're probably in the wrong room. Just, the last reminder. Um, just want to emphasize the importance of research, and a lot of junior medical students probably don't realize how important research is. It's very important for clinical practice because to find out what's the most advanced techniques on improving patient care. But it's also very important for your career progression as well. Lots of academics say publish or perish. So if you have done a quality research, your aim should be getting it published. And tonight, our speakers will be sharing their experience of how to ace your RS projects and potentially how to get those things published or presented at a conference and things like that. And before I start, one more thing. I'm sure most of you have got a piece of feedback form. As a society, we always seek to improve the quality and contents of our lectures. So please fill up the feedback form and hand back to us before you guys leave. And without further ado, I'll let Manjit kickstart the talk.
Hey, good evening, guys. Thank you. Oh, sorry, I just jumped someone's bag. Thanks for attending. So my name is Manjit. As you can see, I'm a fourth year medical student. So I've done RS2, RS3. Before RS was introduced, it was called SSM. So I've done a couple of those as well. So I have quite a good experience of doing lit reviews. I think I've done about 6 or 7 now. And I'm also the president of Lakers. So if you have any questions, or want to come talk to me after, any ideas for events or anything, then feel free to talk to me or any other committee member. So I'm basically going to tell you how the basics of what a lit review is and how to do it. So just as a general kind of questions, anybody know what I mean by a literature review? Anybody, keep your hand up if you've done a literature review. Okay, so a few of you. What do you understand by the term literature review?
Reviewing literature.
Yeah, I mean, I can't argue with that, that's true. A review of literature. Any kind of advances on that? Okay, so what I'll do is I'll start by telling you what a literature review isn't, so what you shouldn't be doing. So some people do get a bit confused, and kind of some of the things that I would advise you to not do is to kind of use really broad topics and just argue a point of why your research is important. So I've read some of my friends' reviews and stuff, and there's a lot of discussion about this research is really, really important, and they kind of haven't said why. They haven't said why they're doing the research, and they also haven't said what the actual research is, so what's out there. What a literature review also is basically an annotated bibliography. So we don't want a beautiful list of sources and not a good context to what's actually in the review. So what is a literature review? What it is basically a search of kind of journals, databases, books, ebooks, and basically you're collating evidence about a specific topic. So the research has already been conducted, and what you're doing is you're collating all this research into one document. So somebody can read your document and essentially answer a question which you've made up, essentially. So some advice is to plan in advance. One of the shortfalls in my first project was that I really didn't know what I was doing. I was kind of a bit clueless. So one of the ways I overcame this was by setting really specific aims and objectives of why I'm doing the research. So I'll discuss some kind of methods later of how you can format questions, kind of how you can find the niche areas which haven't been researched much. So does anybody know what a systematic review is? Anyone? Has anybody done a systematic review? Because a lot of people do get confused between the terms. So anyone know what a systematic review is and what the difference is? 2 gentlemen at the front who have done one? No, okay. So I'll basically just tell you then. So a systematic review is a more in-depth study. So it's usually done by a lot more people and it takes a lot longer. So a literature review can take from weeks to months, but a systematic review can take from anywhere from months to years. And it's a higher level of evidence, basically. So you've all seen the hierarchy of evidence. So the case reports at the bottom, the RCTs at the top. If you haven't seen that, definitely look that up. Usually comes up from PP exams. So what a systematic review is, basically you're trying to analyse all the evidence within a particular field and then find out what is the best practice within this field. So if you're talking about treatment, kind of what's the best treatment for this particular patient, kind of things like that. So search strategies we will come on to. Okay, so does anybody know kind of what the process of a literature review is? Like, do you have a rough idea? So we've done one? No? We're getting blank looks? Okay, I'll just go for it then. So generally what you do is you need to start with a broad topic. So what happens at this medical school is that you'll choose a convener associated with a topic. So the last one I chose was blood pressure. So blood pressure is just very general, as you can imagine, very broad topic, and also very highly researched. So then what you need to do is you need to narrow it down, and this is the really key part that I was discussing earlier. It's about getting your aims and objectives. So you really need to narrow it down and find a very specific question. And there's kind of formats and tools that you can use to do this. But we'll discuss those next. So the next point I put is searching and choosing the literature. So what I mean by this is using things like databases, using journals, using books, using ebooks. And what you need to do is you need to have a background of the topic you're researching. Then what you also need to do is work out your aims and objectives. And then following on from them, that is when you can kind of go to your databases and search for the literature which is relevant to your question. And all of the literature you find is what is going to format the evidence for your question. So one of the studies I did was looking at the effect of birth weight on blood pressure. So I was trying to see, does low birth weight predict a high blood pressure in adulthood? So the kind of things that I looked at was like databases online, journals, articles, kind of anything that's been recently published. And I'll show you what I found out later. So analysing, interpreting the literature. Some of you might have heard of things like CASP tools. What this is basically like a critical appraisal tool. I'll mention it later as well. I'll just give you a little bit of an idea of kind of how you use these tools. These kind of CASP tools, mesh terms, are really key buzzwords that I would advise you to put into any of your projects that you do. It basically just looks really good, and it's kind of how you should format your literature search. It kind of gives you structure to your review. So the structure review, this is kind of the general structure. You can change bits if you like. I always like to start with acknowledgements. So a bit of a general thank you to my convener, anyone that's hosted me for a day visit or anything. Then introductions, a bit self-explanatory, a bit of background, your aims, your objectives. Methodology we'll come on to, and I'll show you the rest kind of as we come on to them. So this is generally what a database search looks like. I've inserted a few kind of random terms just so I can explain what they mean. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is when you're using the word and. So I've had some kind of first, second years get a little bit confused about when they're searching databases and kind of when do I use and, when do I use or. I think when it's explained to you, it just makes it a lot easier. So if I'm typing in blood pressure and birth weight, what I'm doing is I'm going to find all the literature on that database which has those two terms in it, so blood pressure and birth weight. However, there are other words for blood pressure. It might be BP. If you're looking at high blood pressure, it might be hypertension. If you're looking at low birth weight, sometimes they shorten it to LBW. So that's when the or comes in. So instead of putting blood pressure, you can put blood pressure or BP. If you're looking at high blood pressure, you can put high blood pressure or hypertension. And I'll kind of show you later how I form these kind of searches. But this is like the really important bit that you do need to get right. Okay, referencing. At Liverpool, we all use Vancouver Liverpool. There are different ways. Everyone loves EndNote. That's available on university systems. You can also use a kind of Google, you can Google literally reference generator. I would be careful though, because I would use something that saves the references. I've used a reference generator for one of my kind of essays that I had to do. But I found out that because it doesn't save them, when I'm editing bits and rearranging the references, I have to do it manually, so it's very time consuming. The best invention I've ever come across is Mendeley. It was recommended by one of my supervisors, and you can download it for free. And what it is basically you can insert all your references, you can literally put a PDF straight into the kind of whatever it is, like app. And what it does is it kind of formats all of the references for you, and it works in conjunction with Word. So you can kind of Google how to use Mendeley, and it will literally have a 2-minute video tell you everything. And that has saved my life. My referencing gets done so quickly because of it. It literally does everything, like Vancouver, makes your bibliography, formats your references. So I'd highly recommend that one. So common errors that we come across. So some of the things that kind of go wrong is not organising enough. So when I mentioned your kind of aims and objectives at the start, if you don't start with a clear aim, then you're not going to end up with a clear conclusion. Obviously, the conclusion you might not know, like you might not come to an actual conclusion. It might be quite vague what the research is saying, but you do need to kind of have a good structure to start with before you get to your actual searching the databases. Another piece of advice is to make sure that you only choose the literature which is actually relevant. So people get a bit kind of snapped in when you're doing your database searching. Let's say you've come up with 12 results, they just go ahead and use all 12. However, all 12 might not be relevant. So one of the searches I did, as I mentioned, was low birth weight and high blood pressure. However, I had loads of random articles that had those terms in them. They weren't relevant to anything I was kind of studying or looking at. So just be careful, kind of comb through things carefully and just take your time. Referencing. Okay, be very careful when citing references. If you're citing something directly from an article or a book or anything, you need to use quotation marks. You use quotation marks if you don't change what you are citing. So if I'm citing it exactly word for word, you need to use quotation marks and then cite kind of the author of the book. And then use Mendeley because it will do everything else for you. Summarizing, what I mean by that is don't literally get all of your articles and then summarize them all into a massive 2-page paragraph. I think conveners prefer it when you structure your discussion. So one of the things I like to do is sometimes do a bit of a for and against almost and split my articles, and some of them will overlap, they'll be for and against, but I feel like conveners are a lot more happy when you have structure to your discussion. You're not just saying this study shows this study shows this, because it's not, you're not analysing anything, you're literally just regurgitating what you found. So yeah, avoid that if you can. Writing in the past tense, that's generally how you should write your literature reviews. What I mean by except when discussing their significance is basically if you're saying things like this study shows there is a possible link between X, Y, and Z, that's obviously going to be in the present tense. So just be careful kind of what tense you're using, because I know sometimes I look and think back kind of, this doesn't really make sense. I've used a mixture of like all tenses here. So yeah, just bear that in mind. And publication, I'll come on to. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you one of my, I just kind of talk you through what I've done and what I've come across. So this is kind of like the title page, generally standard. Okay, so abstract. One piece of advice about the abstract is always do your abstract at the end, because you can't do it at the start. You don't have the discussion, you don't have the methods, you don't have the results. But I think people get a bit too drawn in because it does come at the start of your lit review. They kind of get drawn in by doing it as you go along. My advice is to do it at the end. You know what you've concluded, you know kind of what's going on, and it literally will take you so much like shorter time to do it. So introduction, what I generally do is a bit of background. It's worth asking your convener what kind of level you're targeting. So sometimes I've targeted to, if a lay person picked up my paper, they would understand. Sometimes I've targeted to, if an academic picked it up, they would understand. Usually kind of the rule is targeted to kind of your kind of expertise, so targeting medical students. So if a medical student picked it up, they kind of, the stuff that they need to know. So what I mean by this is you don't need to explain what blood pressure is, how it's measured, you know. Whereas if you're targeting a lay person, you do need to be like, blood pressure is this is how you measure it, this is why we measure it, kind of this is the consequences of blood pressure. So yeah. So methods. This is the key part where I think a lot of people do get really confused and they get a bit lost. So I always like to include a little bit about my search strategy. So what have I done? So I had a meeting. This is what the meeting said, and then kind of what I did. So I searched journals, searched books. Just a bit of general overview. This is a tool I mentioned earlier, so the CASP tool. What it is, you can Google it. It will give you a set of questions to critically appraise all of your articles. The benefit of this is that you have to critically appraise your articles anyway, so it just gives you some structure and it shows that you've actually thought about it. If you Google it, it will come up with loads of different lists. So it will have some for case reports, it will have different ones for kind of qualitative study, it'll have like a different set of questions for each type of evidence that you have. So I'd highly recommend like including that in all your research. Ethical approval, even if you don't need it, it's worth saying that you don't need it. So actually doing the search. So just want to draw your attention to mesh terms. So there's basically a database called the mesh database, and what it does is you can insert terms that you want to search for. So if I'm looking at my blood pressure review that I've done, I can put blood pressure in, and what it will do is it will kind of give you the key terms that you need to use in your database searching. I'd highly recommend including that in all your literature as well, and there's a few examples in my thing. I mean, I can send a list to you as well. Inclusion, exclusion criteria, that's quite, I think most people know what that is, but just briefly, so when you're on your database searching, you need to narrow down your search results. Obviously, you don't want thousands and thousands of articles to look through, so you need to have inclusion, exclusion criteria, which is set before you kind of do your search. So things that you include are articles in English, and then you could quickly appraise that and say, oh, I didn't have time to source translations, because obviously it's a very short project time we have. Projects within the last 10 years, so kind of make it recent, make it kind of relevant. Data extraction, so for this particular study I needed to extract all this data from every single article. Usually I think you can end up with anything from about 5 to max like 15 articles for kind of like an RS SSM type thing. Be wary of going too high because there is a lot of workload. I think I had about 12 articles and it took me about 2 weeks to extract all the data. So results. Generally, my results, I always use the Prisma statement. You can Google all of these buzzwords and they will explain them as well to you in more detail and also show you how to do them. So essentially what this is my database search. So what I've entered from start to finish. So how I've started with all of the literature in the whole of the database to how I've ended up with the 12 that I've actually used in the review. So things that I've done is I've included all my mesh terms, I've included my inclusion and exclusion criteria, and then the last step I did is I screened all the abstracts. So I think I ended up with 50 articles. Obviously it's not possible in an RS project to use 50 articles. So what I did was I looked at all the abstracts, read them all, and kind of narrowed it down to 15 that seemed relevant. Then what I did is I actually read all 15 articles in full, so like the full article, not just the abstract, and then I found the ones that are relevant, which was 12. Level of evidence, so I use this classification scheme. It's just basically saying how good is your evidence. Obviously, RCT's gold standard, you get a 1. Case reports, case series, you get a 5. It's just kind of a way of evaluating how good your literature review is. This is my general results table. And then the discussion. So I split mine into supporting and like against the hypothesis, so supporting, contradicting. Like I said before, structure is the key thing in your discussion. Don't just kind of go straight into it with all your summarising. So eligibility, what I mean by that is I basically said why I've excluded certain articles. So when I was screening the abstracts, why did I exclude some of the articles? Things like that. So critical appraisal, this is all the CASP tool stuff that I've mentioned. And then public health implications, it's always really good to add that at the end. You kind of need to justify what the results of your literature review are showing. So I've done this review, this is what it's shown, this is the impact it could have, in the public on the future. And then conclusion, you need to also add kind of what you would do if you were to do this again, and kind of things like that. So just going back to the end. So this is the kind of how to grade your papers, see how good they are. This is generally what a data extraction table looks like. And this is the CASP tool. So across the top are all the articles that I had, and on the side are all the questions that I asked, and then I had to fill all that in, which took a while because I had 12 articles. And then a timetable. It's always good to get that in at the start, really. Yeah, so just the last thing to show you guys. So I know some people might be interested in getting published, so I managed to get one of my SSMs published. The way I would advise going about this is just talking to your convener. So looking back, I wish I'd spoken to them at the start and kind of been like, I'm interested in getting this published. Is there a chance you might be able to? Because they will be able to kind of tailor the work you do towards getting published. The way I did this is I retrospectively thought one day I really want to get my work published, and this is the article that I thought I put a lot of work and effort into it. I think it might be worthy of getting published. So I contacted my convener, and he was just gave me some general advice. So contact some journals and kind of see what they think about your article. I was lucky. The Journal of Geriatric Medicine were very keen to take my article. It just looks nice. You know, it's something you can get points for if it's on PubMed ID. It's always nice to get published, and they do most of the work for you usually, so quite good. But yeah, any questions? No, that was a whistle stop tour.
So what was that? Sorry, someone else has a question.
Okay.
Mesh terms, can you explain that to me again?
Yeah, so what they are, as opposed to just going straight into your database and searching, so I'll use my example that I've used throughout, so the high blood pressure and birth weight. What a mesh term is that a term that's very commonly used. So you go onto the database and you search for high blood pressure, for example, and it will give you a list of terms that are commonly used. So it might give you like BP, it might give you like hypertension. And then what you do is you should insert those terms into your database search. So they're like key terms that you should be using. So if you're a bit like ambiguous about the words you're using, so I might use kind of like adult, I might put it into the mesh database and it might come with like adult male and adult female. So you need to like incorporate all of these into your database search. Does that answer your question?
So I don't understand the relevance of it. So when you mention them and when you use them, so you're saying that you'd use BP or blood pressure or hypertension, with that your mesh terms?
Yeah, so if I was looking at high blood pressure, then I would use high blood pressure or hypertension. If I'm just looking at blood pressure in general, obviously I just use blood pressure or BP. If you have a look on the mesh database, it does tell you. I think it makes more sense when you go into the database and type in a random word, and then you'll see what I mean. If that makes sense. It'll come up with like a list of suggestions, and it'll make a lot more sense when you see it. Anything else at all? No.
So when you got published, did you just have to contact them?
Yeah, so what I did to get published was I contacted a couple of journals. Be wary, obviously, you can only commit to one usually. So one journal was very, very keen to have it published, and then they basically told me what I needed to do. So I had to send off some forms, I had to edit my article, I had to make sure, because then they have like web layouts and things, I had to make sure everything was kind of how I wanted it, and yeah, they pretty much guide you through the process. They're aware you're medical students, like you haven't done this before. They're quite good usually. Yeah.
In your article, did you stratify for anything like smokers versus
I didn't know. No, this was one of my very early. I think it was my first review I did. So no, at that time I was still new to the process.
But if you wanted to, how would you get guidance for how to approach that statistically?
Yeah, I think it depends on the convener, because a lot of people have very good reviews that their convener is very keen. So my last convener was very, very keen for me to get involved in research. So if I asked him anything, he would be quite happy for me to come in and discuss it. Whereas I know some conveners are a lot more laid back. You might not get the support you need. But if that is the case, there are a few options available. So you obviously can contact us. We've had experience. We may be able to help you. And also the medical school, as if your convener's not doing their job, you know, they're paid to do that. They have signed up for it, so they kind of should be helping you and supporting you. So if you're not getting that support, if you want to take it further and do your statistical analysis, then you should be getting that really.
Did you use Mendeley instead of EndNote, because rather than putting it into the list and doing it referencing in the library?
Yeah, that's one of the reasons. But I had EndNote on my laptop anyway. I just prefer Mendeley. I think things just a lot smoother for me. Just makes my life a lot easier. Yeah, you could try both. Literally, just try both, see how they feel. But
So if you use Mendeley, you can't use their computers.
no, what she's referring to is you can get EndNote for free, because usually you have to pay for it. But you can get it for free if you use the library computers. But then I think the issue is that I have to keep coming back to the library, and I like to sit at home with my laptop, so Mendeley.